In the year 258, a Roman governor in Paris ordered a bishop beheaded on a hill outside the city. The sword did its work. The bishop kept talking. By then, he had already survived the rack, the flames and the teeth of animals starved for the arena. None of it had stopped him. The blade was supposed to be the part that finally worked. Witnesses would later swear it didn't. They said the body did not fall the way a body should. They said that for 6 miles, a headless man carried his own skull through the hills north of Paris, preaching the entire way, until he finally lay down and did not rise again. Here is where this story ends. A Roman missionary named Denis, executed on a hill the locals already used for pagan sacrifice, buried in secret by a woman who risked her own life to do it, and enshrined in a basilica that would one day hold the tombs of 40 kings of France. Paris would build a city around his grave. Paris would eventually forget the man buried beneath it. This isn't a story about how a man died. It's a story about what a voice can survive, and whether death actually has the authority we assume it does. Let's go back to the beginning, to a stranger stepping off a boat into a swamp town nobody in Rome had ever heard of. Chapter 1. The preacher sent to mud. Somewhere around the year 250, in the reign of the Emperor Decius, the Bishop of Rome made a decision that would cost several men their lives. Christianity was spreading through the empire, and the church in Rome wanted a foothold in Gaul, the wild, half-Romanized territory that is now France. So 7 bishops were commissioned and sent out, 1 to each of 7 cities. Most of them are barely names today. One of them was sent to a marshy little river-crossing town called Lutetia. Its Roman name meant mud. History would later know it as Paris. The man sent to Lutetia was Denis, in Latin, Dionysius. Tradition holds he came from Italy, though nothing reliable survives about his birth, his family, or his early life. He arrives in the record the way most of these men do. Already a bishop, already sent, already expected to build a church in a city that didn't want one. Lutetia was a Roman garrison town, built on and around a hill, sacred to older gods. A place already thick with altars, sacrifice, and priesthoods that had held power there for generations. Denis didn't arrive to an empty field. He arrived into someone else's temple. He made his base on a small island in the Seine, at the edge of the town, and began to do the only thing a missionary bishop really does. He preached, in public, in a place where the wrong sermon could get a man killed. And people listened. Not crowds at first. A few converts, then more, drawn by something the old temples weren't offering them. The city's pagan priests noticed. They always do. A new god taking followers from the old ones is not a theological disagreement in the ancient world. It's an economic and political threat, and it gets treated like one. There's a phrase worth holding on to here, because it's going to matter later. A dead man cannot preach. That was the assumption everyone in Lutetia operated under. Priests, governor, crowd, and probably Denis himself on an ordinary day. Silence a voice, and the voice stops. It's the oldest rule there is. Someone was about to forget to tell Denis. Chapter 2. A city. Turns for a while. The arrangement in Lutetia was tense, but survivable. A foreign preacher, a handful of converts, some muttering from the temple priests. That changed as the church kept growing, and Rome's persecution of Christians kept intensifying under first Decius, and later the Emperor Valerian. What had been local irritation became imperial policy. Christian leaders were to be identified, arrested, and made an example of. The priests of the old gods, watching their offerings dry up and their crowds thin, went to the Roman governor, a man later sources name as Fesenius Sicinius, and demanded action. This is the moment the story actually hinges on. Denis had a choice every missionary bishop in this era eventually faced: go quiet, blend back into the empire, and survive, or keep preaching, knowing exactly what that decision would now cost. He kept preaching. There's no dramatic vision here, no angelic visitor, no burning bush. Just a man who had already decided, long before he ever set foot in Gaul, that a commission from the church was not something you walked back once the crowd turned hostile. It's a quieter kind of courage than a miracle, and arguably a harder one to sustain, because it has to be renewed every single day. The danger keeps growing. The governor gave the order. Denis, along with a priest named Rusticus and a deacon named Eleutherius, who had labored alongside him, was arrested. Chapter 3. The Long Prison. What followed, according to the accounts that survive, was not a quick trial. It was a long imprisonment and a long attempt to make 3 men recant. Later, writers described them: scourged, racked, and thrown before wild beasts in a public spectacle, meant to break their resolve in front of a crowd that had once been their congregation. Tradition also holds they were exposed to fire. We should be honest about what we actually know here. The earliest solid source, the 6th century historian Gregory of Tours, gives us almost none of this detail. He simply records that Denis suffered various torments for the name of Christ before dying by the sword. The vivid catalogue of specific tortures, the rack, the beasts, the flames, comes from a later account written centuries afterward, and historians treat it as traditional elaboration rather than verified fact. What both the early and late sources agree on is the shape of the ordeal: repeated, public, designed to extract a denial. None of it worked. Chapter 4. The Hill of Sacrifice. Eventually, the governor ran out of patience for spectacle. Denis, Rusticus, and Eleutherius were taken to the highest hill in the city, a site already associated with older sacrifice, a place where Roman religion and older Gallic worship overlapped. Centuries later, that hill would carry a name remembered by every person who has ever visited Paris: Montmartre, popularly understood as the Mountain of Martyrs. There, the 3 men were beheaded. This is where the account Gregory of Tours gives us stops. What comes next belongs to tradition. Clearly, explicitly tradition. First written down centuries after the event by a later abbot, who was, by his own admission, trying to elevate the dignity of the church built over Denis's grave. It should be heard that way, not as verified history, but as the story the earliest Christians of Paris told each other about what faithfulness looks like when it refuses to end on schedule. Chapter 5. The Voice That Would Not Stop. The tradition says this: after the blade fell, Denis's body did not collapse the way a headless body should. It rose. It retrieved its own severed head, and it began to walk north, away from the hill of execution, preaching the entire distance, a sermon delivered by a voice that no longer had lungs to power it. A dead man cannot preach. Someone forgot to tell Denis. For nearly 6 miles, according to the legend, he carried his own skull through the countryside north of the city until he reached a spot he seemed to choose deliberately, and there he finally lay down and did not rise again. Whatever you make of the specifics, the early church that told this story wasn't interested in special effects. They were making a claim. that the thing Rome had just tried to silence could not in fact be silenced by a sword. The empire had a method for ending a voice. Something in this story insists the method failed. Chapter 6. The Grave that built a kingdom. A woman named Catulla, a Christian of the city who had likely known Denis and his companions, recovered the bodies at real personal risk. Sheltering a condemned man's remains was not a safe thing to do under an active persecution, and gave them honourable burial rather than letting them be discarded. Over that grave, she raised a small shrine. That shrine did not stay small. Within centuries, it had grown into a basilica, and by the 7th century, under King Dagobert, into a full monastery that French kings began favouring above every other church in the realm. Denis, the executed missionary from a city that once had to be told what Christianity was, became the patron saint of France itself, and eventually given to the whole town that grew up around his tomb, still called Saint-Denis today. 40 kings and queens of France would eventually be buried near him. A structure built to remember one silenced preacher became, quite literally, the resting place of an entire nation's monarchy. There's a strange coda to this story worth knowing, because it says something honest about how legends grow. Centuries after Denis's death, French writers began identifying him with a completely different man, Dionysius the Areopagite, a 1st century convert mentioned in the Book of Acts, converted by the Apostle Paul himself in Athens. Linking the two gave the French crown a direct line back to the apostles. A compelling story, but wasn't true. A mistake historians have long since corrected, and one worth naming plainly, because separating the real Denis from a borrowed identity is part of honouring who he actually was. Not an apostolic age celebrity, but an ordinary 3rd century missionary who kept preaching in a city that had already decided to kill him for it. If you've ever gone quiet in a room because saying what you believe would cost you something, a friendship, a reputation, a job, a family's approval, Denis's story isn't really about a severed head. It's about the space between the moment you're told to stop and the moment you actually do. History forgot them, but they were faithful, and now it's our turn to remember. Subscribe to Forgotten Heroes of Faith